Hello, I'm back again with another one of my hip hop album rankings videos. Had a bit of time over the holidays with a lot of stuff happening. There's a new washing machine which is no longer in the way, so I've got a bit more room to actually do stuff now. um, but yeah, so I thought I'd get back to these and try and get a few more of these out. For this one, I'm going to be looking at The Game, West Coast rapper, famously parts of the Aftermath slash G Unit label. Then that fell apart and struck out on his own a little bit. And, Mr. Game has had, a large amount of albums to sort of fill out his discography. Is supposed to be retired now, although as we'll discuss, there's been moments where he has been retired in the past. But this should mean that this is an actual complete overview of the discography, under the impression that he won't be releasing any more albums. So let's have a look through them. Now, make a little side note just to start off with for the compilation album. Always have trouble with that word. Blood Moon, Year of the Wolf. Now, I don't believe it does officially count as an album, as it is a compilation album, which is used more of a way to establish his burgeoning record label at the time and the artist on that label. And some people probably do classify it in the same way that Jay-Z's Rock the Familiar classifies as an album. If we were to include this album, it would definitely be at the bottom. However, there's not a lot to it. It doesn't really give a good showcase for Game or the rising artists they has on there, Scheme and Dub. They don't get a lot of time on there. The time they have is fine. There's a couple of high moments for them on there. A lot of it is just kind of radio grabbing collaborations with more major artists. However, the track The Purge is far and away the highlights of the album. So if you are going to check out something from there, definitely check that one out. Trouble on My Mind's quite a good one as well, and a couple of the outro tracks aren't so bad. But I'll say it doesn't really count as an album, so I'm not going to necessarily qualify that into it. So we are looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it would have been 10 with that, but let's just say we're not counting that and just go with 9. So number 9 on our list, it's tricky, but I think I'm going to have to go with 1992. This was released in the sort of autumn, late autumn of 2016. The title 1992 is supposed to be a throwback to that year being an important year for Game and sort of California West Coast rap in general. The LA riots took place at that time. Dr. Dre came out with The Chronic, which introduced the world to Snoop Dogg. Of course, the cover of 1992 sort of pays homage to Doggy Style with the same similar art cover by the same artist. And yeah, so there is moments on the album which tries to delve back into that timeline. The first two tracks, Savage Lifestyle and True Colours / It's On, in particular, tell more about Game as a youngster, his upbringing, his birth, even his mother and father both being involved in gangs and the effect that had on him and his family. After those tracks, it kind of goes a little bit up and down in terms of the content. There are a lot of moments where Game is clearly trying to use different samples, so kind of my hair keeps sticking up, to go, showcase that time of his life. So songs that were around at that time or before that had an influence on him. There are moments though where these samples do kind of threaten to overtake the actual songs that he makes. However you want it is basically a trap remake of the Soul to Soul song. I grew up on Wu-Tang, uses a lot of Wu-Tang's Cream. The There's an interlude, Fuck Orange Juice, which he looks at O.J. Simpson. Frozen again for a little bit, that doesn't keep happening. Which uses the Grandmaster Flash, the Message sample, which obviously was also used very heavily by Ice Cube for the Check Yourself remix, so I understand why that's there. But again, sometimes Game can have a habit of wearing his influences too heavily on his sleeve. Obviously, criticised for name dropping artists and products. I mean, Kanye, Drake, Jay-Z, Nas all get about half a dozen name drops each on this album, which is only 13 tracks, including a bonus track. We have 92 bars closing out, which isn't much more than just an excuse for a Game to do a lot of bars on a track and tell everyone that he was annoyed with Meek Mill at the time. Other than that, the main highlights, apart from the opening tracks, really is later on in the album we get the track Young, word redacted, which discusses Game growing up with a boy who they ended up being, Game ended up being a Blood and the other boy ended up being a Crip, and how when they were at school together they had that falling out because of separate gang affiliations, and a very mournful tale of how they just grew apart and due to the gang culture just weren't speaking to each other anymore. And it's nice again just to get more of that backstory of that culture. So other than that, there's not too much more on it, which is because it's quite an easy album to get through. It's not as long as a lot of Game albums tend to be, but the content's a little bit up and down. Kind of similarly, we have Jesus Piece, which was the last album released on Interscope as the end of 2012. This album was sort of a vague concept album, sort of looking at being a street guy and also a man of church. So there's a sort of a church influence throughout the content and the beats sonically that have more of a spiritual feel or churchy, not sort of in the sense of big organs or whatever, but with sort of speed up samples, more choir sort of sounds. The opening tracks, Scared Now and Ali Bomaye, are just kind of bar tracks featuring Meek Mill and 2 Chainz and Rick Ross respectively. They seem to just be at the beginning of the album purely because they didn't fit the theme as well as a lot of the later songs did. which is fine to sort of introduce the album, but they are both pretty long tracks, so it means it takes a while before the actual concept of the album kicks in. With the title track, produced by Kanye West, featuring Kanye on the chorus and a verse from Common. Again, the material is a little bit scattered, but the more we get the looking at the divides and marrying together of the street life and the church life, the album makes a bit more sense and feels a bit more relevant. So as it goes on, we get more of this happening with some of the strong guest appearances as well. Game manages to get some strong verses from the likes of J. Cole, Kendrick Lamar, Pusha T. One of the strongest tracks on here, just it feels very sort of majestic, is the track Hallelujah featuring Jamie Foxx, where in terms of content, it's not necessarily anything different to what Games said on past albums or even future albums, but as I say, it feels so rich to listen to. Jamie Foxx brings a really great chorus on there. And it's around the time of the album where it really the pieces kind of fit together a lot more and the songs make a lot more sense. All That Lady is another highlight, kind of for a different reason. Again, it doesn't necessarily fit the theme of the album too much, but it's a very lush remake of the D'Angelo track Lady, featuring Lil Wayne, Big Sean, Jeremiah in the chorus. Fabulous turns up for the outro and disappears, which is a bit strange, but apart from that, it works. There are some bonus tracks as well on the deluxe version, including the track Church with Trey Songz and Big Chip, which is shoehorned into the middle of the album, but is lost on the actual version. It only appears on the deluxe version for some reason. We also, in the bonus tracks, we have the track Dead People, which again doesn't necessarily fit the theme of the album, so I can kind of understand why it's not part of the actual album, but it's a banging Dr. Dre track, and in terms of content, you could argue it could have fit in between some of the more spiritual, godly tracks, just as a bit of a palate cleanser to show more the differences in terms of the content. And same with Blood Diamonds, which is also a bonus track. I don't remember, it isn't that great, so I can see why that was left off. But yeah, I mean, sonically it feels more cohesive than a lot of Games albums, which is a benefit to the album, but again, the content doesn't always, it kind of gets a little bit repetitive, and the sound can get a bit repetitive as well. So that's kind of why the album doesn't rank quite as high as some of the others, even though it still works really well as a full project. So anything else about that? No, I think that's it. So move on to number 7. We're going to go with what is supposed to be the final album, Born to Rap, released in November 2019. As Game turned 40, I believe it was actually released on his 40th birthday. And again, we go to the length of the album for this as the kind of main drawback. I appreciate with it being his last album, he wanted to try and put as much on the album as he could, but this does mean that we get quite a lot of filler tracks. The Avengers game obviously sounds pretty motivated on most of these songs, and doesn't fall for some of the easier rhyming trappings that he sometimes falls for. There's several features on the album as well, which kind of adds some. I guess he has at least tries to feature more rising West Coast artists as a way of sort of giving back, particularly towards the end of the album. We have appearances from Jay Stone and D Smoke, I believe it is, on separate tracks. Dom Kennedy appears a few times on the album as a sort of protege, I guess, in a way, for the album. Nipsey Hussle, the late Nipsey Hussle, appears on the album, both in an interlude at the end of the title track, talking about how he gave his demo to Game when Game was just in the hood, in his car with a gun, just to show the the streetness of Game. And then there's an actual collaboration between the pair of them, which then leads into I Didn't Want to Write This Song, featuring Marsha Ambrosius, Don Kennedy as well. The tribute track to Nipsey Hussle. This is in the middle section, where it picks up quite a bit with all these tracks back to back. The intro, because it starts fairly strong with a nice smooth Ed Sheeran intro, then feeding into some of the other opening tracks. Then again, the end is kind of where it picks up again. There's the separate stages of it, the intro, the very middle and the very end, with some filler stuff in between these segments. Again, towards the end, we have Hug the Block, about the passing of his father, and the issues with his own family, his brother, the falling outs they've had, with an interesting sample in the chorus of Slum Village's Selfish, which is otherwise a completely different song from this one, but the use of the chorus actually works very well for it, so it's a smart choice in the end. So there's into Ask For Me, produced by DJ Khalil, which brings more of a traditional Aftermath sort of feel to the album. We have Rewind 2, a sort of sequel to Nas's Rewind track, which is kind of an obvious take of the song, but at least Game writes it fairly well. And then again, this gets to the very final track where Ed Sheeran appears again for Roadside. There were the rumours that Game and Ed Sheeran were going to be doing a project in the past, and hearing Ed on the intro and outro of this album kind of makes me wish that that project did actually happen. But Ed definitely adds a lot to this album as a way of Game sign off in his career. A lot of the album does discuss his beginnings and things that have happened in his career. He certainly loves 300 bars, because that gets, not just on this project but on a lot of his projects, it gets mentioned a lot, as do a lot of the producers and artists that he's worked with in the past. But again, as a sort of a closing of his career, it works, even if there are several tracks which could have been taken off of it. So we're now number 6. We're going to go the ID album, the Red album. released in August 2011. It was sort of a comeback album, as we'll discuss in a bit. There's, Dr. Dre is heavily involved in the album in terms of having sort of a narrator's role for the album, as well as appearing on the track Drug Test with Snoop Dogg and mixing. So he doesn't actually produce the song, but he mixes it. It's actually produced by DJ Khalil, who also produces the track Ricky on the album, which is one of the highlights tracks, as it takes the very haunting samples from the scene of Ricky's murder in Boys in the Hood. Just brings a very cinematic, even more of a cinematic feel to the track with the instrumentation. And yeah, I mean, Dre's involvement, it took a while for this album to come out, and there was a lot of changes to the album as it was released. Dr. Dre was supposed to be an executive producer originally, and was supposed to actually produce on the album, or produce a lot more. Neptunes, who do have a executive producer role, were also supposed to produce the album quite heavily. A lot of these tracks sort of leaked and ended up on mixtapes, and I don't know, I do kind of feel that a lot of those tracks could have been part of the project instead and kind of made the album a bit better. There's certainly a lot of quite a lengthy album. There's 21 tracks in total, including the Dr. Dre skits. A lot of them do feel a little bit meandering, sort of the middle towards the end. There's lots of features on the track to kind of bolster the album a bit, but again, it does fall a little bit victim of over saturation of guests. Is what the 1992 album was more or less devoid of guests, as there was another common criticism of Games. The only guests on the album were uncredited vocalists. But Game also has his tendency of adopting the sound of his guests, not to sound exactly like but there's definitely moments in his cadence and delivery where you can see that's what he's trying to aim for. But still, there are strong tracks on the album. Ricky and Drug Test have already been mentioned. The opening track, The City, with a great Kendrick Lamar feature. We have the sort of street single, or sort of lead single, Red Nation, with Lil Wayne. With a very clever use of the slowed down Zombie Nation sample, like Cool and Dre. Cool and Dre often produce very good tracks for Game. This is one of Game's strong suits, is he does have a very good ear for beats and often brings some very good, well-produced tracks onto his album. Sort of later we get Born in a Trap, produced by DJ Premier, to sort of have a West Coast rapper on a DJ Premier track, and Mama Knows with Nelly Furtado, the only Neptunes produced track on the album. But again, it's a very well done and listenable album, but there's a lot of stuff which does get a little bit forgettable as it goes on. So this kind of why it drags down a little bit. It's a shame because as a full project it does still kind of work. So we get on to number 5, LAX, August 2008. So this was at the time supposed to be a retirement album for a game, as it's stated in the album credits. And at the time, there was a feeling that game had been affected too heavily by sort of the split from G Unit, and that it was just going to sort of leave and focus on other things, which obviously didn't end up happening. Which is fine, because we did get some good projects after this one. There's not a lot on the album which makes it feel like a retirement album either, so it wouldn't necessarily have worked as a retirement album in the same way that Born to Rap kind of does. There's a very typical game album of strong beats, lots of features. We get originally this was supposed to be Diary of Compton, the DOC, I believe it was going to be called, but it wasn't. I believe the official reason Game gave was because he couldn't get all the surviving members of NWA and DOC to be involved in the album, or to that effect. Ice Cube appears on there, on the track State of Emergency, which is sort of another one of Game's kind of loose adaptations of the previous songs, being Cube's own Ghetto Bird. And we get a nice sort of heavy light follow-up of Cool and Dre tracks and Knots tracks, which all kind of land one after each other. My Life with Lil Wayne, Money, California Sunshine featuring Palau, and You Heard featuring Ludacris. A very strong set of tracks where Game particularly sounds very passionate and hungry, and it helps bolster this segment of the album. Further on, we get some more smoother tracks in the form of Touchdown with Raheem DeVaughn, Angel with Common. Following this, we have Never Can Say Goodbye featuring Latoya Williams, where Game discusses the deaths of Tupac, Biggie and Eazy-E in sort of a clever way of mimicking their flows for each of their verses, in a time where Game's fanboyness works to its advantage. We get Dope Boys, which sounds really which just knocks really heavily, and one of my personal favourite tracks. It's not saying a lot particularly, but the strength of how a game's saying it particularly helps by the live drums from Travis Barker, really make this a very heavy banging track. There are some down points towards the middle of it. Gentleman's Affair with Neo is not quite as interesting or enjoyable as the track Camera Phone with Neo, which got added to the album later. But still, as a whole, it's an enjoyable album. It follows, say, a lot of the Game formula, and most of the tracks do feel worth the attention that they're given. So, finishing off with the track Letter to the King with Nas, both of them speaking to Martin Luther King in a sense. We also have an intro and outro from DMX in the form of one of his prayers, commonplace for his own album, but managed to bring them on these albums to bookend the album, which is a nice way of doing something a little bit different for the project. So it's kind of on the same level as the Red album slightly, but I just kind of feel that the tracks are kind of stronger on this one than the Red Album. Probably because I didn't hear enough of the. There was probably more leaked songs for LAX. More of its DOC form, which is a title I prefer infinitely, but it is LAX. But still, apart from that, it still feels stronger as a full album. So now we get on to number 4, which is the documentary 2. Be interesting to sort of discuss this and the next one, you'll see. So this was October 2015, so roughly 10 years after the release of the documentary. And so they're in the sort of similar way to Born to Rap, adds a lot of features and production to try and go back to sort of the feel of the documentary and just Game's overall career at that point. Starting off with another Kendrick Lamar collaboration, On Me, sampling Erykah Badu's On and On. Then Step Up, which samples Gangstar 70 Arena. So again, a lot of heavy use of earlier popular tracks, which largely work. Standing on Ferraris is quite heavily influenced by Kick in the Door. Doesn't quite work as well. But so, I mean, there's a lot of tracks on the album again because Game albums quite often do have a lot of tracks. So you can get a nice selection of tracks which do work and tracks which don't work. Don't Trip, which kind of brings together Ice Cube and Dr. Dre again over Will I Am beat as a nice way of kind of going back to the NWA sort of era. Will I Am and Black Eyed Peas initially being signed to Eazy-E's Ruthless label, and Will I Am is actually a very good West Coast producer. This is often forgotten with the more commercial Black Eyed Peas material, and there's ups and downs. There's some very West Coast feeling stuff with again Will I Am appearing for the outro track LA with Snoop Dogg and Fergie. Summertime, produced by Mike Will, is a very smooth track. Towards the end we get some of Game's more interesting tracks. The documentary 2, which very similarly to the original documentary track looks just at how long he's been rapping for and about his career to that point. We get New York, New York, one of Game's more interesting, perhaps braver tracks in terms of content. Not only for essentially, calling out homophobia, which for an artist not only of mainstream hip hop credentials, but as an artist who has had some homophobia controversy in his past, for him to speak out against it and on this track is again very brave. Also on the outro of this track, talking about the murder of the rapper Hayes, who was originally signed to Aftermath just like Game. His murder of his wife and subsequent suicide, just to come from the perspective of someone who knew him and didn't suspect anything like that to happen. The shock of him doing this and the thoughts for his wife's family of having to go through something like that. Just to hear that coming from Game is quite it's very good to hear, particularly as it was something that didn't really get that much attention at the time. It certainly felt, at least from mainstream media. So yes, generally a strong project. It's it should really be discussed, I suppose, the same as a number three album, Documentary 2.5. But they are technically separate albums, so we kind of have to discuss them separately. Documentary 2.5 does kind of hit things better than Documentary 2. It certainly feels like he left some of the stronger tracks for this album, but knowing that because there were going to be two albums coming, they didn't want to leave all the good stuff on the first album. We begin this album with the New York skits, where he has a discussion with radio DJ Sway about the incident at Hot 97, I think it was. Essentially, after Game was dismissed from G Unit and brought a bunch of his people through to the studio to confront 50 about this. So a bit of a live interaction, reenaction of this event. Which, even though obviously we've heard a lot about the 50 and Game problems, it's kind of nice to, I suppose, get this proper reenactment of it. For Sway to say that he's never actually been told about this feels a little bit disingenuous. Also, the fact that at the end of this skit, a bunch of people pull up on Game and Sway in this car with guns, and Sway apparently isn't phased by this whatsoever. But yeah, it's an intro skit, so it's whatever really. We then get a couple of appearances from Anderson .Paak in the first two tracks. We then get a nice sort of section of tracks together. Gangbang Anyway with J Rock and Schoolboy Q, which ends with a skit discussing the development of the initial the creation of the initial Bloods and Crip gangs up until and the first murder of a Crip shooting a Blood. I believe it was. Forgive me if I'm wrong on this. This is what I believe from the skit, because we then get a reenactment of that with the Blood being shot and his mother appearing and sort of being distraught about this and the fact that nobody's doing anything about it, which then leads on to probably the strongest track on the album, The Ghetto, again produced by will.i.am, featuring Nas. Both Nas and Game have two verses on the album on this track, and obviously Game steps his lyrical game, if you pardon the wording, up, featuring with Nas, particularly in his final verse where the beat switches up and then leads again into the next track, From Adam, featuring Lil Wayne on the chorus. Later on we get sort of a kind of smoother section of the album, kind of narrated by Doggy Styles, DJ Easy Dick, and so we get these songs like the smooth Quick's Groove, produced by DJ Quick, the very funky Up on the Wall, which is perhaps a little bit crowded, trying to feature Ty Dolla $ign, YG and Problem, but the Battle Cat production is so funky for this track. It just proves that Game can make some really funky tracks when he feels the need to. Nice to give that sort of different style for this album that we don't hear a lot from any other West Coast rappers, let alone Game. Then later on we get the very overcrowded My Flag / The Homies, which isn't a great track, even though it's kind of the lead single of it. the video for it, which was very low budget, even featuring just like a low budget reenactment of the outro of this track. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but anyway, then we get towards the end, Like Father Like Son 2, remake of the original track from the documentary with Busta Rhymes on the chorus again, as just a way of rounding up what how the game was on the documentary, and sort of coming back around full circle a little bit with these albums. Yeah, they probably could have been spliced together to make one actual album. There's probably enough filler on both of the albums that they could have been put together to make a better full album. But the highlights on these albums, particularly on 2.5, just really outweigh a lot of the filler stuff. I feel it's clear that Game was very passionate about trying to get back to the kind of sound of the documentary. And when Game is motivated, he sounds so on point. So I think that's what definitely helps these albums up. So number 2, Doctor's Advocate, said at one point by the Game to be his best album. Not quite well, I don't really agree with that, but I can certainly see how he can almost get to a conclusion like that, because it definitely is strong throughout in terms of production. Bringing on will.i.am again to make a very funky West Coast track, was also in terms of in the form of Compton, which is also quite a street banger as well. The whole album certainly has more of a traditional West Coast feel than even the documentary did, which again helps this album out quite a bit in terms of revitalising the West Coast sound. Production from DJ Khalil, Scott Storch, Swiss Beats appears for the very hard-knocking scream on them. Game sounds very intense and ferocious on there. One Bloods, the lead sort of streets track, with the Junior Reid sample, and all the way down to the end of it, the high-tech produced smooth old English. Again, with Game looking back on his older life, his brother getting shot, and things like this. Doctor's Advocate, the title track, one of Game's drunk tracks, where he's confessing how he didn't mean to leave Dr. Dre and cause problems at Aftermath and this kind of thing, with Busta Rhymes playing a sort of advocate's role for Game in a sense. A highlight track there as well. In the end, we have the Mr. Porter produced and Jamie Foxx featuring Around the World. Then going on to the epic Why You Hate the Game, produced by Just Blaze and featuring Nas and Marsha Ambrosius. And at 9.5 minutes, I believe it is, it's a very daring track to say the least, but for the most part it plays off well. The Just Blaze production works it's so lush and orchestral even, that it helps the track along throughout the entirety of this 9 minutes. So I mean, in terms of like the content. There's quite a few mentions of the 50 Cent beef and it being over or not being over and this kind of thing, and maybe doesn't necessarily delve in too much in terms of his backgrounds more than any of the other albums do. But say there's certainly a very strong West Coast feel for the project. Game feels motivated in his lyrics. There's nothing lyrically in there that drags the album down too much. It feels like a good successor to the documentary, which of course is where we're going to go to now for number one, documentary. So the documentary, the game's debut album, released on Aftermath Records, beginning January 2005. The only album that game would release under Aftermath, and I mean the Aftermath influence is very clear on the album. Dre plays a very heavy role on the album, producing 6 songs and the intro skit, as well as mixing several of the tracks, and apparently remaking some of the beats which weren't in terms of Havoc produced Don't Need Your Love. Havoc lost the beat and so Dre had to remake it. Hate It or Love It, the main single from the album produced by Cool and Dre, was apparently completely remixed by Dr. Dre, but still sounded very similar to the initial version that they made. And I mean all the stuff that Dre does on the album, the clearly Dre has a strong ear, just like Game does, for production, for the sonic elements of tracks, and I mean everything on it just sounds so crisp. All the from the intro, the haunting West Side Story, into the more the samples with Dreams, with Kanye West production, very banging Higher, Church for Thugs produced by Just Blaze, the title track Documentary, which again looks at his own career at that point, and how long he'd been rapping for, and all the achievements he was going to create. Yes, there is quite a heavy reference again with the name drop into other artists and the things that he would do with the album, the achievements he would have, which he did sort of make with this album. And the all the way up to the outro with Like Father, Like Son, the initial original version. It certainly feels like starting with West Side Story and ending with the birth of his son for Like Father, Like Son. Does sort of complete that sort of cycle of the album. And yeah, I mean, from getting Nate Dogg on there twice for Where I'm From and Special, which helps even more with that Aftermath West Coast sound. Timberland for Put You on the Game. The high-tech produced Runnin' featuring Tony Yayo. And Eminem for We Ain't. Mary J. Blige on Don't Worry. Yes, there is perhaps an element of the album being overshadowed by the guests, as many of Game's albums can be, but Game, certainly for a debut album, showcases his level of rapping, how much he is a fan of hip-hop, but that certainly influences heavily the stuff that he comes out with, and means that in terms of lyrics it's not as sort of substandard as some debut albums, particularly around that time may have sounded. Game clearly wants to try and make an impression on the album, and it's it's only one of my favourite produced albums to date, and you can tell I loved it to death. It's so broken. Um, but yeah, so that's where I'm going with game from top to bottom. I'm trying to get back into these, so I'll hopefully get a few more done soon and get some more arts out of the way. And hope you enjoy, and we'll see you again for some more.